everybody. If you are observing, I think I recognize everyone's name on here. If you're with us today and you're not a member of the steering committee, this is a meeting of the steering committee of the Vermont Climate Council. Thanks everybody for being here and thanks for joining us. I think in the chat, I'm just checking right now, Jane pasted the link to the materials, specifically the agenda, which apologies has the wrong date at the top, but it really is today's agenda. And we're looking to do a couple things. We want to confirm the council agenda for October 17th. And we wanted to do one more round on the memo that came out that you all as a steering committee didn't get a chance to speak about, but in the council there was a conversation, and there's some implications of that that I know Jane wanted to put on the table, and I think you all might want to discuss as well. So we wanted to spend some time on that. So that's really what we wanted to do today, those two things. There'll be public comment at the end of the meeting. And then when we get going just now, we have to do our basics of minutes, and there's a quick update on subcommittee membership. But that's what's going on with today. Oh, hey, Jared, good to see you. So any questions about today's agenda? Any suggestions, things that you also would want to include discussion of? It's all good? Okay. All right, let me know if you can't hear me okay, because sometimes my earbuds aren't the best. All right, so let's do the basics. There's minutes to approve from last meeting. They're linked in the agenda. If you need a moment to open them up, remind yourself. Thanks, Jane, for dropping them in the chat. I'll give folks a moment just if they want to click through and remind themselves of those minutes. Would anybody like some more time? Any concerns about the minutes? Okay, super. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so minutes are approved. Appreciate that. Subcommittee changes. Marion or Jane, could you? Thanks, Chris. I note that in the chat if you want to talk about the House Committee appointment terms. Okay, let's do a quick pass with the subcommittee membership changes. Marion or Jane, if you could walk us through what's new that you'd like the steering committee to be aware of and approve, I think is the official thing here. Yes, the steering committee approves it.
Yeah, so it's just two things. Want to highlight that Megan O'Toole, who graciously stepped in as Science and Data co-chair, is going to step down as co-chair, and we'd like to recommend that Colin Smythe step in as co-chair of Science and Data. This will sort of be clearer, perhaps, as we talk about sort of the shifts in the Climate Action Office and staffing and capacity later on when we talk about the A&R memo. But we've been coordinating this with Jared and Megan. And Megan's capacity will be better directed as a subcommittee member on cross-sector, since that is where her expertise lies. Not that she's not exceptional at science and data things also, but Colin will be great as co-chair, and so we're recommending that he take on that duty. And then also in line with the Climate Action Office responsibilities shifting and reorientation, Marion has been recommended to be an official member of Rural Resilience and Adaptation, recognizing the transition that she's also undergoing in her job duties.
Great, super. And just in case, Jane, not everybody knows Colin.
Yep,
it's Colin's role.
Sorry, TJ. Yep, okay. Yes, Colin Smythe for folks. He currently is in the Air Quality and Climate Division in DC, and he's transferring into the Climate Action Office and the Central Office in the Secretary's Office. And he will be working also on the inventory still going forward, but also taking on a larger responsibility about tracking and progress associated with the Climate Action Plan as we stand up our new measuring and assessing progress tool in the coming years. And then, yeah, TJ and Marion had already reminded me this, but I forgot to mention it still. There's a new youth member on cross-sector mitigation, Stella Fox, who's been added to sort of carry through that vision of having youth representation on all the subcommittees.
Okay, great. So three changes that are happening. You all as a steering committee can weigh in here. I think it's your official job to say good, that sounds great, or if you have concerns, what those concerns are. Any quick reactions or concerns on those three changes from steering committee members? Oh, good.
I will just note that science and data hasn't had an opportunity to discuss that change, but I also don't know as though it's necessary, given that in the past the co-chairs, we've had one administration or state government co-chair and one co-chair who's a council member from the House and Senate appointments, and my view has been that, and I would see if this aligns with others' views, but I think the practice has been that folks who work for the state have identified, in terms of their capacity and the best alignment of roles, the appropriate co-chairs. And so I would defer to that, and I fully support Colin stepping into that role. I think he will do a great job. I just want to note that there is a difference there, and that hasn't been able to be discussed with the subcommittee yet. But I feel like it is largely, because it is a co-chair seat on the state government side, what works best at the recommendation of the relevant agencies and departments. So just wanted to note that, though.
Thanks, Jared. That's helpful to know. Okay. All right. Super. Thanks, everyone. Let's dive into then the council agenda for, it's not next week, is it? It's the week after next, I think. Yeah, the week after next. And if someone could throw that in the chat as well, and it'd be helpful to click through that. What's being proposed in this draft agenda for the council are two big conversations. One conversation is to follow up on and to finalize the budget requests that we started talking about in the last council meeting. And now all the subcommittees, oh, thanks, Jane. All the subcommittees are going to come back, and we've given them a October 7th deadline to provide specific recommendations on the budgeting piece using the format that we discussed in the meeting last time. So that's one thing for the council meeting, and to spend a block of time on that, and hopefully you'll have the materials, a week and ahead of time, if not even a little bit more if we're lucky. So that's block number one. And block number two is around the biomass task group, their final document, which Jane, are they calling them recommendations, or are they calling it sort of a concluding document or something?
It is a diverse document that includes recommendations, next steps, findings. It has it all.
Okay, great. So we're going to look at that.
Yes, it
document.
includes recommendations.
Super. Okay, so we look at the document. It includes recommendations. It also has some next steps in it. So those were the two big blocks. And as Chris points out in the chat, we don't have nailed down our opening just transitions reflection. And Chris, that's a nice idea. If we want to, we could just quickly, why don't we take it from the top, Jane, and let's quickly talk about the just transitions reflection, and then let's talk about the two other big blocks that are being proposed. Actually, let me pause for 1 second. The two big blocks being proposed, does that sound like the right use of time for our council meeting? Is there something else that you had expected would happen at the council meeting that you're not seeing on this agenda? Jared?
On the first one, on the budget, I think definitely. I do have a process question with regard to the task group recommendations. And this is just in terms of wanting to make sure that there's kind of a full process and consistency with how we've done this before. So my recollection is that anytime there's a task group that is formed that makes recommendations, that those recommendations are first shared with subcommittee for deliberation and discussion. That was the case with the transportation task group recommendations going in front of cross-sector, getting unanimous support before they were then presented to the council. That's been the same with other task groups. I understand that biomass is a little bit complicated because it's more cross-cutting and has more kind of subcommittees involved than the normal task group, but it does feel to me a little bit kind of out of the process for a task group to bring recommendations directly to the council without the kind of relevant subcommittees having the chance to hear those recommendations, provide discussion and feedback first. Like my understanding is that these recommendations haven't even been seen by or discussed by cross-sector mitigation yet. So I just think in terms of good process and making sure that we're ready for a full council conversation where the kind of subcommittees that have kind of issue areas of overlap just have the chance to understand this, be comfortable to ask questions. So especially if there are recommendations in there, it would feel to me like it might not be ready yet for the council to act unless we have that time in the subcommittees with those recommendations first. I don't know which subcommittees that should be, but at the very least, I would think that Ag and Eco and cross-sector, perhaps just transitions, should have the opportunity to hear and discuss these recommendations first, just for like a full good process in keeping with the other processes we've used.
Okay. Great. So one of the reasons we thought it would be important to have an initial look at these, again, what we're suggesting is this is an initial look in which the council provides some input. It's not a decision-making moment. We thought it might be helpful to do that now so that we can circle back later in the year and actually have a decision-making moment at the council on it, and the council's had a chance to look at it previously. So I would be curious how others react to Jared's suggestion that actually doesn't even go up the council yet. And the council waits until a number of subcommittees had a chance to look at it and formulate some thoughts around it. How do others feel about that? You okay with that? Secretary Moore, go ahead.
Oh, Liz had her hand up first. I'll let her.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Liz. Yes.
Oh, sure. I hear Jared's point. It came up in my memory, and Jane can shake her head if I'm wrong, but it did come up in the task group meetings. The point that you raised, Jared, about whether it would be going first to subcommittees rather than the council, and process being what it is and timing being what it is. My memory of the task group discussion on that was that subcommittee work would probably be necessary on some of the next steps, maybe many of the next steps, that are recommended. But because it was such a, like you said, kind of cross-cutting task group, having it go to the council, would be okay here, just because otherwise we likely will find ourselves with further potentially months of delay on some, pretty good work that the task group has done. When the task group feels that there are certain conclusions that we're likely to bring to the council, but then a number of continuing steps. So making sure that work can be done, I think, was one of the reasons we thought to bring it to the council, or the discussion was, let's bring it to the council rather than the subcommittees. Recall that Ag and Ecosystems, I think, had started the larger list that then became what the council asked the task group to kind of work from, a year ago. I don't know whether Ag and Ecosystems, if anyone's on that subcommittee and could speak to it, has been briefed, but my guess is that, like cross-sector, they have been briefed. I'm not sure what that communication has been like.
Just to clarify, cross-sector hasn't seen those recommendations.
I haven't seen them. The actual task group has not seen the document. There is a drafting group that's working on it. Jane has let us know that it's close and that we'll likely see it next week. But there is some possibility the task group won't complete the process, and that would be a different issue with regard to our council meeting. But I think that Jane has a high degree of confidence having sat on the drafting group. And I share the confidence just sitting in the task group that I do think we're starting to, hear from one another and find some areas of commonality. And if the report is what I expect it's going to be, which is a number of steps that need to be continue to be looked at, my guess is that we'll be able to give it to council to look at. But the task group, just to be clear, has not seen it yet.
Okay.
So the briefing in cross-sector has been on process rather than on actual recommendations at this point.
Secretary Moore?
I was going to say much of the same things Liz said, which was just the concern that this could result in a fairly extended delay, excuse me, and having this brought to the full council because of the number of different committees that the work touches on, and just recognizing that this has been a very intensive process to get to this point. I'm not sure that delay, further delay is helpful.
So we've got two views in front of us right now. And one is because of the nature of this particular task group and the importance of making forward progress. It's important to bring this initial product up to the council. And then there's going to be some time between now when the council decides for subcommittees to weigh in and the task group also to react to comments that the council has. Or as Jared says, you could just hold off. Jane?
I guess I just wanted to orient you all to the way that we've been framing it at the task group. And it has been that this is an interim progress report to the council that includes a series of proposed recommendations, findings, and next steps. But it really is this need to sort of take a pulse and see where we're at as a task group. And I think the driver of the council meeting has been helpful to help sort of force some of those questions and force getting our ideas on paper. I shouldn't say our ideas, their ideas on paper. And so view your role as a council can be to ask in the process for a next step to include more robust conversation at the subcommittee level before it comes back in what I expect to be at the December council meeting, because as you all see, transportation isn't on this agenda. Biomass is, and we expect to suggest transportation to come back as a final consideration for the council in November and biomass in December. So that time between this October council meeting and December could include some next steps that the council would want to see before you all take action.
Okay. Jared?
Yeah, I guess I would just say, recognizing that it has been a cross-cutting task group, I'm certainly comfortable with it staying on the agenda in terms of an update. All I was trying to, and I think that the language can be a little confusing here because it sounds like there are some initial recommendations in here. It doesn't sound like those are planned to be acted upon next week or at the next council meeting. And I would just, I guess my feeling as a counselor is that if we're going to be asked to make a decision, I just want to make sure that we'd had the chance to do deliberation and due diligence through the subcommittees whose work would be affected first. But if this is really an update on the progress to date and a kind of preview of some of the discussions that would be then had with the subcommittees about making recommendations for action at a future date, that's fine. And I may be misunderstood that this is really just an update, not requested action on behalf of the council.
That's great. Okay. I think we're circling around something, and that sounds good. Let's take a look at this language that's in the draft agenda right now. So we're calling it draft conclusions, and we can figure out if that's the right way. And what we're saying we're going to do as a council is provide feedback, capturing a shared set of notes on the draft conclusions of the biomass task group. And the council will decide how and whether to adopt these conclusions at a subsequent meeting. Does that work for everybody? Okay, I need to
Yeah,
look.
and maybe just in by what process? Because I think that if there are specific actions to be recommended, it would be good for the related subcommittees to have a chance to discuss those before that action at the council, requested action at the council meeting.
Great. So one of the things that the council can do here is to confirm that roadmap between now and December. Okay. Great. Chris?
Yeah, I think probably without saying, but I'll say anyway. Yeah, establish that process going forward for anything like this. To Jane's question about, like, what does it mean to amend the cap? What action has to be taken? All that good stuff.
Right. And that's going to apply for whatever biomass you do and the transportation stuff, right? What that looks like to be added to the cap. Yeah.
Anything else going forward, right? I was just thinking, use this as an opportunity to define that process.
That's nice. Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, great. Thanks. That's a good clarification. Let's jump back up to the top here for a second. For just transition reflection, Chris, you had mentioned doing the VTrans thing. Would that feel more on point and applicable than, say, an overview of Justice 40?
I guess one of the reasons I thought that the VTrans one might be, I have no problem with Justice 40. I also understand that Rich Coward is suggesting that maybe something be arranged to reflect on the massive flooding and that in Asia, and how that's really, I just coincidentally put the article in the chat about that, and how climate change is impacting people who aren't actually producing the greenhouse gases to cause the major impacts. With one of the reasons I suggested the VTrans one is I think it also relates to the advanced clean vehicle rule, and just how VTrans is looking at having a more robust equity framework by which they make decisions and engage with people. So a lot of good opportunities there.
Okay. How about this? We'll do one this time and another one the next time, kind of thing, and figure out who's available. And is that okay?
Fine with me. As soon as she should certainly weigh in.
Okay, great. And I know, Liz, you've got your hand up on this too.
Yeah, I'd appreciate a Justice 40 discussion, because to me it feels pretty related to the budget recommendation discussion that follows on it. And so to the extent the Justice 40 initiative, just transition reflection could be geared toward how that will be actually realized in Vermont, I think that could be really helpful. So I guess I'm putting in a recommendation to keep the item that you have for this meeting, given the budget nexus.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Secretary Moore?
I was just going to say, I think Justice 40 is, depends on what folks' expectations are. This is a complicated book of work, and frankly is directed by individual executive agencies at the federal level. So I'm not sure, and we can talk about it in broad strokes. I'm not sure we're going to get to the specifics that some may desire. And just so long as we all understand what is or isn't in the art of the possible at this point, I think it's fine. I just worry that folks are going to want a lot more detail than we may have access to, because it's going to flow to the state as part of individual programs and initiatives through the agreements we sign with federal agencies.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good cautionary note, and I think it's one of the reasons to do it as well, right? So you can at least get that basic understanding going on a little bit more about how it impacts the work that, for instance, this council might do. Okay, so how about we do this? How about, in principle, we stick with the Justice 40 piece. We keep the transportation one in our back pocket. It might be a nice way to get into the transportation conversation that we're going to have next meeting. And that seems like it might be a nice fit as well.
And I would imagine also that transportation equity framework would also ultimately feed into Justice 40, because a big chunk of our federal dollars is around transportation.
That could be, yeah. Okay, great. I want to talk just a second about the budget piece here. And the reason it's interesting for you all as a steering committee to put your heads into this for a moment is to imagine what the output is from the council's work on this, because you all will receive from the subcommittees a whole bunch of recommendations, ideally with some prioritization, because we asked for that, you asked for that. And then is the ideal outcome that that's presented, maybe there's some conversation about it, and essentially you as a council say, you know, let's draft a memo that goes up to the administration, the governor, to the legislature, and it says, our subcommittees worked on this, here's their output, here you go, and you attach all the work? Or are you assuming that you as a council might do some additional work on top of what comes in from your subcommittees and, I don't know, reprioritize, redo something else? What do you imagine would be an appropriate outcome from this, so that, you know, someone like myself who's trying to orient the conversation can push you towards that place? If you understand my question, like, what's the output of this conversation? Did I confuse you in my question? Erica?
And maybe this, just as a subcommittee co-chair, maybe we can like reframe it from a question that we had, which is, are we just going to group all of the recommendations into one memo? There's no, you know, is there going to be further prioritization at the council level, or is it bringing it together as a lump sum and saying, these are our recommendations?
That's exactly how I think the question should be phrased. Yes. And TJ?
Yeah, I guess along those same lines, just another piece of information for the steering committee to consider is that the cross-sector mitigation committee, one of its main recommendations with regard to funding was related to outreach, but there wasn't a specific number or item there, and that the cross-sector mitigation committee felt it was incumbent upon this group, actually the steering committee, to take all of the subcommittee's recommendations and on outreach and say, okay, how are we putting this forth to the council? You know, we need outreach for you know, the thermal sector and the transportation sector, and then whatever the other subcommittees come up with for biomass actually as well. And so how does that all come together in a format? You know, it wasn't for the cross-sector mitigation committee, didn't feel they were able to kind of see the big picture of what all the committees were doing in order to kind of make a coherent, like reasonable recommendation on a funding amount and a path forward on outreach. And so wanted to bring it up here at the steering committee, or directed Rich and I to bring it up here to actually say, hey, how are you guys going to shape this, or can you shape this? Because we don't have that big picture view. And so I guess that's not a comment on your question, David, but another kind of thought process that I wanted to share, and how the committee thinks about it.
Yeah, and there's some issues like that where it cuts across. It would be helpful to take a bigger view. Jared, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think, David, that my thought about the outcome of this is that ideally, I think for sake of both clarity and usefulness, we probably do want one single document that compiles the council's budget recommendations and is shared with those groups that you mentioned, both the administration and the legislature. I think the process to get there will depend on the what we receive and to what degree it has the specificity of information we'll need to be able to do that. I mean, I think that there's probably a few different categories of what might be in there, right? There could be some things that are very straightforward that one subcommittee identified and that the council as a whole thinks is right and defers to them on, and it's just in. There could be, I think, other categories where, and I would look to Jane or others who've been tracking what's happening between the subcommittees, where there might be very similar recommendations or overlapping recommendations, and we would just want to be able to make sure that those are packaged appropriately and that there's not redundancy. I mean, I think it's good if multiple subcommittees are making the same recommendation. I think where it could get more challenging if there's recommendations that aren't kind of in the framework that was suggested, so don't have the detail and information in them to actually make a recommendation, or if it's a recommendation that a subcommittee makes that for some reason other counselors may not align with. We'll have to see when they come forward, but I do think that the end goal is one compiled document that has those recommendations, ideally with the council's sign off on them as a council rather than a series of subcommittee recommendations.
Okay. Yep. I'm starting to see a vision here. Abby, how are you?
Out of breath from moving fence, but hello.
Sure.
So the way that, to TJ's point, the way that our committee talked about at least framing some of the outreach recommendations, because we didn't have a specific plan and our committee hasn't been meeting that much, was to back up the recommendations of just transitions within our recommendations to try to do exactly that, to consolidate the power of that recommendation to say that we really feel like this group of people is well equipped and has been working on the thought processes and potential methods by which to make that happen for far longer than we have. And so backing them up and then sort of ensuring that however that's rolled out is touching on the subject matters that are relevant to all the subcommittees seems important, but it also then allows for, a cohesive strategy and a lot of support behind their recommendations, which I think is I think it's important for us to do. Yeah, so
Great.
just wanted to share that.
That's great. And it sounds like on that issue of engagement in particular, there's some circling in around like deferring to just transitions a little bit, making sure it's coherent. That sounds interesting. Someone else had a hand up. Was it Chris? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess, as I've said before, to my mind, it'd be, I know there's going to be some areas of agreement with whatever the administration, we basically know what the administration position is and their recommendations on the budget. There may be some other things that come out that may not necessarily jive with what the administration is. So it could be that ultimately what's created is, here's the position of the administration, and appropriately so. And here are some other recommendations that came out of the council, just so that way the legislature, the public, everybody else can kind of know, what the broader positions are. We may be able to reach total consensus, but we may not either also. So that was my thinking, and just try to do it in a spirit of collaboration, not confrontation.
Okay. Right. And that's another aspect of this is I heard Secretary Clauser say last meeting that while the agency, the administration folks are eager to participate in the conversation, at the end of the day, they actually need to recuse themselves from decision making. If I heard you correctly, Secretary Clauser, on that, and that gets to your point a little bit about sort of who's making an announcement, like who's making a pronouncement here. So I guess what I'm hearing is, though, on this issue of what you want to do is you want to review what the subcommittees have come up with. You want to look for those opportunities where there's some cross coherence, and make sure you're creating that coherence. And then you want to turn that into a single document that gets transmitted out. That's what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing sort of, we need to therefore reprioritize, or we need to do this, or we need to do, it's like, you need to look at it. You need to see where where it can be made more coherent, and then give an instruction to consolidate into a single document with a memo. Secretary Clauser.
Yeah, thanks, David. I just wanted to add to, from the administration's perspective, I think where we could also be helpful is to point out where work may already be conducted in certain areas and where there's overlap, right? So I just didn't want that to get lost from the conversation. In addition to what we are recommending with respect to the climate office's budget, I think there's also an opportunity, once recommendations from the Climate Council are more kind of solidified and organized, there is an opportunity for the administration to talk about where work is already being done in that space, where maybe additional work could be leveraged, or to, you know, just prevent duplication. So I just didn't want that piece to get lost. I know it's not really a process question, but I do think there is an opportunity there at some point after all of the recommendations are compiled.
Sorry, I'm muted. I do want to confirm, though, that this is the meeting in which the council will make a decision about what to forward on, right? So it needs to happen at this meeting. It can't get pushed back into subsequent meeting because it becomes increasingly sync with timelines. Jared?
I want to raise one additional issue that it won't come up, I don't believe, from any of the subcommittee. I mean, it might. I could be wrong. I'm aware that it won't come up from science and data, but it's a cross-cutting issue that I think we as a steering committee need to grapple with, and should consider making a recommendation as a steering committee about, which is in response to the memo about administrative support and the focus of A&R staff, specifically Jane and Marion, shifting from kind of a coordination and support role of the council to implementation of the climate action plan through the climate office, which is great and important work. I just want to very clearly raise a concern that, given that we are a council of largely volunteers who have day jobs, that the prospect of not having a dedicated staff person in terms of coordination, communication, and support across the council, I think would be really, it would make it very difficult for the council to function. And I think that it would also present some challenges in terms of us being able to have our processes in place, have our structures in place, so that we are both ready to add those pieces to the climate action plan that are currently unfinished, and to pick up and be ready to effectively develop the next climate action plan when it's legislatively required. So I just want to note that I feel like I understand why the rationale behind that memo, and am excited for the work of the climate office. I'm also very concerned about the council's ability to function effectively without dedicated staff on the coordination and communication side, especially, you know, timelines, what's happening between committees, my perspective is, I think we've all served on, or many of us have served on different kind of state boards or councils or commissions. And in my experience, those ones that are largely composed of volunteers who are there by virtue of their experience and expertise or the sector that they represent, it really relies to a large degree on dedicated staff to help make it function.
Hey, Jared.
Yeah.
Hey, Jared. Can
Yep.
I interrupt for a second? Because I think you're doing a great segue to the next piece, and I want to make sure we have some time for the next piece.
Okay.
And so
Yep.
I think the next piece is all about this, right? What you're saying. And so, and Lauren, I'm wondering if you want to jump in on this as well. I feel like the next piece is, what are the implications of that memo that got sent around about how support will happen for council in this shift in a new climate office? But let me open it up, Lauren. If you were going to somewhere else, I just want to make sure I don't lose that.
No, I wanted to
Okay,
follow
great.
up on what
So-
Jared was saying.
Okay, cool. So what we were thinking, we talked about this memo in the council meeting 2 weeks ago. And it clearly creates some of the reaction that Jared's saying right now, and others have said. Rich said it during the meeting too. And Jane, wanted to give you all as a steering committee some time to chew on this as well. And she wanted to put two things on the table as well, I believe. So Jane, if you want to put those two things on the table, then I want to wrap into what Jared was saying and probably where Lauren's going. So if you have a sec, Jane, if you could just walk us through just very briefly what you're thinking as some implications of the memo from your standpoint, and hearing some of these concerns like what Jared was just saying too.
Sure, I'll be brief, knowing that Jared was starting to touch on it and the conversation was already going there. But of course, since we haven't really talked about implications for process and especially administrative process from that memo, I do feel like the steering committee is the right place to have that conversation and then bring forward recommendations to the council on next steps. So wanted to provide space for you all to further reflect on that, specifically the fact that there will no longer be a GWSA director or coordinator, and thinking about what we can do beyond sort of standardizing processes and support for the subcommittee, as Marion and I have been starting to do through listservs and guidance documents and linkage and things like that, that help bolster administrative capacity for subcommittees and others. I just wanted to highlight two other components specifically intended to do so, which is just to reiterate that we have base funding in the Climate Office budget for facilitation services and what that looks like going forward. Some of the changes, we have an RFP that is about to be posted for that. The contract with CBI is wrapping up. And we have a RFP that will be posted that will look for facilitation service capacity as well as the community engagement capacity, and will center some of that decision-making and direction for how those services are deployed with the steering committee. I think there's been a feeling of somewhat amongst subcommittees, task groups, of inequitable distribution of facilitation services. And we want to make that clear that the steering committee will get some guidance on expectations about how many hours are in that contract and timing and budgeting, and then requests for that will come through the steering committee going forward, so that that can be an open and transparent process about how those services are deployed. So stay tuned on that. We hope that the new contract will be in place sometime in November. Again, that the shift of the Climate Action Office staff is really on implementation. And as such, that's how we've been starting to orient the staff capacity from the Climate Office to the council work. We have intend to continue to have a staff member from the Climate Office on all of the subcommittees. Marion is that last one to plug in with rural resilience officially, even though she's already been there. And if we're doing a good job behind the scenes in A&R, we as a Climate Action Office are meeting weekly as a team and coordinating and communicating about the work happening across the subcommittees, so that sort of residual overlap and conversation doesn't just sit with myself and Marion by going to all of these meetings. We as a team are keeping each other informed of the priorities, and as a result can be keeping subcommittees and the council informed through our participation on individual subcommittees. So just wanted to highlight that. And then, so tangible next steps that we've been starting to consider is, I do think the council and the steering committee should set an expectation and start to discuss what a meeting schedule looks like for these guiding bodies long-term, and then therefore a process for how subcommittees feed into that and what the expectations are. And one recommendation that Secretary Clouser and others we've been starting to think about is, while there is, Secretary Clouser is articulated as the chair of the council in the GWSA, and that cannot be changed by statute. You as a steering committee could consider appointing a chair that helps drive the conversations and process conversations at the steering committee in a way that then dovetails and coordinates with the council and drives that decision-making and discussion. So we have never talked about a chair of the steering committee. Kristen has graciously filled that role with David's support, but I think we would support you all considering a different architecture for the steering committee that might help that long-term. So those are some just ideas right now, and this is probably going to merit more conversation or time than we have today, but just wanted to refocus you all on that memo and think about, while it's not the same capacity through point people, I do think that effectively we can start to set up systems that can help you all do the work of the council as you see it fit going forward.
Okay, great. And I'll note Jared's text as well, and a chat as well, saying make sure that there's appropriate budget for coordination and support. Lauren, where did you want to go with this?
Oh gosh, I think after hearing that, maybe a couple of different places now. I raised my hand originally to just note that when I asked using the biomass group as an example, so as I understand it now, coming back from parental leave, it seems like some things have changed, but there's a drafting group of a task group of a subcommittee of a council that is coming up with recommendations. And that just feels really far removed from the people who are appointed to do the work. And maybe that's okay if there were better feedback mechanisms or structure within this process. And so I'm using that as an example. I can't say the same for transportation because I'm less familiar with what that structure looks like and reporting mechanism to cross sector. But being part of both the council and a subcommittee member, the lack of structure or process, or really understanding what this whole body's role is after a 2021 cap adoption between now and 2024 is really confounding to me. We don't have a work plan really as a subcommittee. We don't have a work plan as a council. It would be incredibly helpful if those things did exist. So each of us showing up in those different capacities know what it is that we're doing, especially those of us who aren't being paid to show up. I don't count myself among them, but there are many in this process who aren't being paid and keep showing up to all of these different iterations, kind of with no end in sight or no structure or process in sight. So that was the comment that I was going to make. I mean, agriculture and ecosystems were pretty much meeting ad hoc. I think the only reason we met last week was because there was a budget opportunity. So it made sense for us to convene and discuss. But aside from that, I don't know what our role is anymore. And then after hearing kind of really quickly reading the memo before this meeting and hearing Jane kind of describe it, I just want to, for the record, just put it out there, a little bit of admitted frustration and disappointment that this is where we're at, especially after all of the work that was done in the early stages of CAP development by a lot of counselors working together with Jane and Marion and others too, to try to come up with what would be a more defensible structure for this process and CAP writing and council at large. That was pretty much regularly like pushed back down and said like A&R will be leading this process and you all will be kind of supporting it. That's at least my perspective and how it felt. And only now for there to be a pretty significant retreat from the process. So, you know, we couldn't come up with a group of CAP drafting counselors And now we're told, just as an example, it's just, I'm probably not being coherent. I'm working on very little sleep these days, but I just want to acknowledge both the fact that this work is really challenging without a work plan. It creates opportunities for there to be 5 or 6 degrees of separation from the counselors. And this retreat from staff support is going to make that, I think, even more challenging. And so what are we doing between now and a 2024 or 2025 cap? We'll just throw that out there as a really big concern of mine.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, those are big questions. Abby.
To follow up on that, I apologize for how late I sent out my sort of request of the steering committee and an update from a more, I guess, from a co-chair standpoint of the agriculture and ecosystem subcommittee. But as one of those people to which Lauren refers, where I'm not being paid to do this work, and I feel I have demonstrated my commitment to it through a range of different means. I literally, I do not, my business is hanging by a thread, as are most businesses of my type. And I don't have the resourcing or capacity to run meetings and try to facilitate the type of meetings that are happening in our subcommittee structure, particularly. I did send along or I guess I didn't send the link, but the link to our video of the meeting last week. Billy and I are trying to navigate a lot and trying to not create more harm. And, you know, he has a full-time job as well. And I don't think that he and I know anymore how to cohesively, strategically, thoughtfully, equitably navigate the realities of our subcommittee at this point, and particularly to Lauren's point, without sort of understanding the framework and context into which we're supposed to be moving forward. It's very difficult to try to navigate our group structure. I think probably, you know, if we're going to come up with any sort of substantive work from our subcommittee, likely we need to bring in more new members, but the idea of trying to do that at this point is well beyond my scope of means. Now, I assume the common response would be, well, Abby, then if you don't have the capacity to resign, if you can't do the job. I think that's a really dangerous response in this moment. I'm one of the, or I believe maybe the only frontline community member on the council, and losing that perspective from somebody who I'm implementing this stuff every single day. So I think that perspective is, I'm going to put a plug in for the importance of perspective like mine. It doesn't have to be mine, but in order to get somebody to replace me with that perspective, the structure can't continue. And I think that that's something that as a council, we really need to grapple with. And you know, what, to Lauren's point, what is the work plan? How are we resourcing it? What is the mandate? And maybe that's a question to the legislature. You know, you put the law in place, and so what is your mandate to us? And for full disclosure, I forwarded the email that I sent last night to the pro tem and Speaker of the House as well, to make them aware of the difficulties that I was having trying to figure out how to continue to move forward. I'm not really sure where that leaves us, but I wanted to add that, or bring that forward today while I was here. Apologize, I have to jump for VLT orientation, but yeah, we're it's been tough, and we haven't met a lot because it's become a wieldy space to hold and navigate, and I am no longer sure how to appropriately do that. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby, for sharing that. So it's coming through loud and clear that there is a frustration around understanding really what the role of the council and the subcommittees are going forward. So that seems like that's a clear request that needs to be addressed in the coming weeks. Jane puts out there as well the opportunity to have a chair of this subcommittee who could help drive some of these conversations and take some more leadership going forward. And implicit in what Jane was saying is that would be one of the legislative appointees, not one of the agency folks. So I'm just curious before we go to public comment, of all these conversations, like, do folks want to schedule up another meeting in the shortest term to talk about setting a chair, addressing some of these issues about purpose and process? It seems like there's some weighty issues here that we can't solve in 2 minutes in a meeting right now.
For what it's worth, I think that's absolutely necessary. I think everybody has raised really important points. I mean, I'm coming off, but I've been sitting here, ever since I saw that memorandum, I've been thinking, how in the hell is this going to work? So I've been kind of quiet because I'm departing, but I mean, I don't understand. It kind of feels like, yeah, I won't get into it now, but yeah.
Okay. How about we schedule up another meeting to focus specifically on these issues, because they seem to be pretty core to the ongoing work. Like, we kind of know what we need to do this year and the budget requests and all that, and transportation biomass, like, we've got that, but there's a bigger question about really what's going on going forward. So how about with Maren and Jane, we'll schedule up another meeting that works for you all in the shortest term to do this. Okay. All right, I do want to offer some time for public comment. And so if you've been listening to this conversation today and you would like to make a comment, now's a great time to do it. And thanks, folks, for being willing to stay on for a couple minutes more as we do the public comment. Annette Smith, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, and I only tuned in for the last 25 minutes, but I just want to echo some of what Lauren was saying. My watching and trying to participate in the biomass task group is kind of, I think, symptomatic of the overall lack of structure. I mean, I would describe that task group, although it's been doing some good work, as rather chaotic. It's not clear who's in charge, who's making decisions about who is going to speak. There's absolutely no transparency about who's doing what or why things are happening. And I think that's kind of where everything is showing up in the disintegration of any structured process here. So that's my input for today.
Thanks, Annette. Other comments from folks? Okay. All right, so in terms of to-dos, it sounds like we're on track for the agenda for the council meeting. It sounds like we as a steering committee you as a steering committee need another meeting in the relatively short term to deal with some of these bigger issues and potentially selecting a chair. And we'll schedule that. I think that's it, unless I'm forgetting something from somebody. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the thoughtful interjections, and we'll see you at the council meeting in a couple of weeks, if not sooner.